the Hartley residence stood proudly at the edge of a quiet San Francisco neighborhood, its modern architecture reflecting the success of the woman who built it. Emma Hartley, now 45, had climbed the ladder of the competitive real estate market, becoming a titan in the industry. Her sleek office, nestled on the top floor of a glass skyscraper downtown, boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city she had conquered. The control Emma wielded over her career had made her one of the most sought-after names in real estate, known for closing multi-million-dollar deals with ease. But behind the immaculate facade, Emma's life was crumbling. Her drive for perfection had cost her far more than the hours she logged at the office. It had slowly eroded the foundations of her family. Her husband, Ryan Hartley, was a once brilliant creative professional. In his early days, Ryan had thrived in the world of photography, his work admired in art circles across the country. But when Zoe, their daughter, was born 13 years ago, Ryan made the decision to step away from his career to focus on their growing family. It was meant to be a temporary sacrifice, a gesture of support as Emma took on the full force of her business aspirations. However, the temporary became permanent, and Ryan found himself in a role that had never been part of his vision for life. Now 47, Ryan felt like a shell of the man he once was. His creativity had been replaced by household routines, his ambitions stifled by the pressing demands of raising their two children, Zoe and Max. Emma's work came first, and his own identity had faded into the background. He had become the caretaker, the parent in the shadows, while Emma basked in the glow of professional triumphs. The years of emotional neglect from Emma had chipped away at his self-worth, leaving him withdrawn and resentful. Zoe Hartley, at 13, was entering the difficult years of adolescence. She was a sensitive girl, attuned to the tension that hummed through the walls of their home. Despite the luxurious surroundings, Zoe often felt alone. She craved the connection that her friends seemed to have with their mothers, but Emma was rarely there. School events, personal milestones, these were moments that passed without her mother's presence. Zoe had learned to stop asking for Emma's attention, she no longer expected it. Max Hartley, 10 years old, was a bright and inquisitive child, but even he had begun to feel the sting of his mother's absence. While Emma built empires at work, Max built models of spaceships in his room, often imagining himself as the captain of a vessel, far away from the cold, distant world his family had become. Max adored his father, but even Ryan's efforts couldn't fill the void left by Emma's relentless focus on her career. Their home was an architectural marvel, a sprawling estate, every corner meticulously designed to reflect Emma's taste for luxury. Yet inside, the atmosphere was devoid of warmth. Conversations at the dinner table were brief and transactional. The family moved through their routines like strangers sharing the same space. Emma barely noticed the growing divide, too engrossed in the next big deal, the next client meeting. It was a Saturday morning when Emma sat at the dining table, her laptop open, spreadsheets and documents cluttering the surface in front of her. She was preparing for the biggest corporate event of her career, a party that would seal her position among San Francisco's elite business circles. Invitations had been sent out to high-profile clients, investors, and colleagues, and Emma was determined to make it a night no one would forget. Across the room, Ryan busied himself in the kitchen, silently refilling coffee mugs and clearing away the breakfast dishes. He glanced at Emma occasionally, hoping for some acknowledgement of his presence, but her eyes never left the screen. It had become a familiar scene, Emma working, Ryan tending to the house, the children in their own worlds. "Mom, are you coming to the recital next week?" Zoe asked suddenly, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and doubt. She had been practicing for months, and the thought of performing in front of her peers both excited and terrified her. But what she wanted more than anything was for her mother to be there, to see her. Emma's fingers paused over the keyboard for a moment, then resumed typing. "We'll see, Zoe. I've got a lot on my plate right now." The words stung. Zoe nodded and retreated to her room, the familiar disappointment settling in her chest. She had learned to mask her hurt, just as Max had learned to stop asking Emma to come to his science fairs or soccer games. Ryan watched the exchange, the ache in his heart growing deeper. His role in the family had become one of damage control, trying to shield the kids from the sharp edges of Emma's ambition. But even he couldn't protect them from the growing distance. Later that day, as Emma finalized the guest list for the party, Ryan approached her. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Emma, we need to talk." She glanced up briefly, her expression impatient. "Can it wait? I'm really busy right now." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It always has to wait." Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Emma to her work. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, but neither of them knew how to bridge the gap. For Emma, success was a fortress she had built around herself, and she was unwilling to let anything compromise it, not even her family. As the day of the party approached, the Hartley household buzzed with preparations. Caterers arrived, decorators transformed the living room into an opulent space fit for the elite, and Emma's mind was laser-focused on every detail. It was her moment to shine, and nothing could go wrong. But the cracks in her personal life were growing too deep to ignore. The evening of the party arrived, and the Hartley home was a spectacle. Emma had spared no expense in crafting the perfect event to impress her clients and colleagues. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the room, and the finest catering in San Francisco was on display. Wait staff moved elegantly through the crowd, offering drinks and hors d'oeuvres to the guests who had come to witness the success that Emma had meticulously cultivated over the years. Emma, dressed in an immaculate gown, greeted each guest with a smile that radiated confidence and charm. Her ability to command attention in a room was one of the reasons she had risen so far in the business world. Tonight, she was the center of it all, and for a few hours, the pressures of family life were far from her mind. Ryan, however, felt out of place. He had been relegated to the role of support staff for the evening, quietly managing household tasks as Emma took the spotlight. He moved between the kitchen and the dining room, refilling food trays and making sure the guests were comfortable. To him, it felt like just another example of how Emma's world revolved around her career, leaving no room for him as anything more than an accessory. As the night progressed, the laughter and conversation grew louder. Business deals were hinted at, compliments on the house flowed freely, and Emma basked in the glow of her professional success. But as she moved from one group of guests to another, she noticed Ryan standing near the kitchen, refilling a tray of cheese. In a moment of thoughtlessness, Emma gestured toward him and, with a smirk, called out, "There's my housewife, always making sure everything runs smoothly." The room erupted in laughter. For Emma, it was just a joke, a throwaway comment to lighten the mood. But for Ryan, it was a public humiliation. The laughter of the guests echoed in his ears, each chuckle a reminder of how far he had fallen from the man he once was. The creative, ambitious person he used to be had been replaced by a version of himself he barely recognized, a version that Emma had reduced to a punchline. The room quieted as Ryan placed the tray down, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of years of unspoken resentment and frustration finally boiled over. Without looking at Emma, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You know what, Emma? You can serve your own damn cheese." Gasps of surprise rippled through the crowd as Ryan turned on his heel and walked toward the front door. Emma stood frozen, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. She had never seen Ryan react this way. In her world of control, Ryan had always been the one constant, the reliable, quiet force that kept everything running smoothly at home. Now, in front of everyone, he had shattered that image. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving an awkward silence in the room. Emma, still standing in the middle of the party, forced a smile and awkwardly apologized to the guests, trying to regain her composure. "I'm so sorry about that. He's just a little stressed, I'm sure he'll be fine." But beneath the surface, Emma felt something she hadn't in a long time, panic. Ryan's sudden departure had rattled her, not just because of the embarrassment, but because she couldn't control what would happen next. And control was everything to her. As the party continued, Emma's mind raced. She tried to laugh off the incident with her guests, but her thoughts kept returning to Ryan. This was more than a momentary outburst, this was the culmination of years of neglect, years of pushing him aside for her own ambitions. And for the first time, she began to realize that she might not be able to fix it with a simple apology or a promise to do better. Hours later, after the last guest had left, Emma stood alone in the living room, the remnants of the party scattered around her. The house was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive. She called Ryan's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She sent him a text, "Where are you? We need to talk." No response. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt a deep sense of unease creeping into her perfectly curated world. Ryan had always been there, a constant presence in the background, managing their home, taking care of the children, supporting her career. But tonight, she had seen a different side of him, a side she hadn't known was still there. The part of him that was angry, hurt, and fed up with being treated like a secondary character in his own life. She walked upstairs to check on Zoe and Max. Zoe was in her room, her door slightly ajar. Emma could see her daughter sitting on the bed, staring at her phone. She knocked softly and stepped inside. "Hey, sweetie. Are you okay?" Emma asked, her voice gentler than usual. Zoe didn't look up. "Dad left." "I know," Emma said, sitting on the edge of the bed. He needed some space." Zoe finally met her mother's gaze, her expression hard to read. "Mom, why did you make fun of him like that? In front of everyone?" Emma blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't mean to, it was just a joke." "It wasn't funny," Zoe replied, her tone cold. "You embarrassed him. You always treat him like he's not important." Emma opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She had spent so long thinking about her own success, her own needs, that she hadn't realized how much damage she was causing to the people around her. Max's door was closed, and Emma didn't have the heart to disturb him. She knew he had witnessed the scene at the party too, and that he probably didn't want to talk to her right now. Returning downstairs, Emma sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chair where Ryan usually sat. The silence in the house was deafening, a stark contrast to the noise and excitement of the party just hours before. She was alone, surrounded by the trappings of success, but it all felt hollow. Emma had spent years chasing control, building a life that was perfect on the outside, but now she was beginning to realize how much she had lost in the process. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar, fear. Fear that she had pushed Ryan too far. Fear that her children were slipping away from her. Fear that the life she had built might not be as indestructible as she had once believed. The next morning, Emma woke to find Ryan still hadn't come home. His absence lingered in the air like a physical weight. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her mind racing with thoughts of how to fix this, how to regain control. But as she sat alone at the kitchen table, the harsh truth began to sink in. Maybe this was something she couldn't control. Ryan didn't come home that morning. In fact, he didn't come home for several days. Emma tried calling him repeatedly, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. Texts went unanswered, and soon the reality of the situation started to hit her. This wasn't just a short-term escape, Ryan had truly left, and the thought of that filled her with a deep unease. On the fourth day after the party, Emma received an email from Ryan. He wasn't coming home anytime soon. He explained that he was staying with his brother for the time being, needing space to think about where their marriage stood and what the future held. He told her that the kids could visit him anytime, but he needed distance from her to figure out his own feelings. The email was brief, but the weight of its implications pressed down on Emma. Ryan had always been the calm, stable one, the person who quietly held their family together while she focused on her career. Now, he was gone, and for the first time in their marriage, Emma had no idea how to fix it. Zoe and Max had noticed his absence, of course. Zoe, ever sensitive to the emotional undercurrents in their home, kept to herself more than usual, spending hours in her room with the door closed. Max was more vocal in his hurt, asking Emma why his dad wasn't coming home. She tried to explain, but her explanations felt hollow even to her. How could she justify years of neglect with a few sentences? Zoe's coldness toward her became more pronounced. Their conversations, already brief, became strained. Zoe was distant, and Max's disappointment was clear in his silence. The household, once held together by routine and structure, was now fraying at the seams. Emma had always prided herself on being able to handle anything, but this felt different. She had thrived on control, controlling her career, her image, even her family's lives to an extent. But now, the people she had taken for granted were slipping through her fingers. As the days passed, Emma threw herself even deeper into her work. She believed if she could stay productive, if she could keep achieving, maybe things would fall back into place. But no matter how successful she was in the office, the hollow feeling followed her home. At work, her colleagues were oblivious to the turmoil in her personal life. She continued to impress clients and finalize major deals, maintaining the image of the unstoppable real estate mogul. To them, she was untouchable, unshakable in her professional dominance. But the cracks in her personal life had started to affect her in subtle ways. In meetings, her mind would drift to Ryan and the children. She found herself hesitating during negotiations, second-guessing decisions that once came instinctively. Emma had always prided herself on being sharp, focused, and in control, but now, control seemed elusive. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating meeting, Emma received a call from Zoe's school. It was the school counselor, letting her know that Zoe had been skipping classes for the past few days. Shocked and embarrassed, Emma promised to handle the situation. She immediately called Zoe, but when her daughter finally picked up, the conversation was short and icy. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Emma asked, trying to keep her frustration in check. "Because you wouldn't care," Zoe replied, her voice flat. "You never have." Emma's heart sank. The distance between them had grown so wide, and she hadn't even noticed until now. It wasn't just Ryan who had slipped away, it was her children too. Later that evening, Emma stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. She looked perfect, her makeup flawless, her suit tailored to perfection. But beneath the surface, she was unraveling. She couldn't escape the truth that she had built her entire identity around being the best, being successful, but at what cost? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Max, looking small and sad. "Mom, are you going to come to my science fair tomorrow?" he asked quietly, his eyes hopeful. The question hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She had missed so many of his events, always promising to be there next time. This time, she knew that another broken promise could push him even further away. "I'll be there," she said, her voice firm. Max smiled faintly before heading back to his room, and for the first time in a while, Emma felt a sliver of hope. Maybe this was her chance to start fixing things, to show her children that they mattered to her more than her career. The next day, Emma left work early to attend Max's science fair. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental to her. As she walked into the school gym, she saw Max standing beside his project, a model of the solar system. His eyes lit up when he spotted her in the crowd. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt something close to pride, not in her work or her achievements, but in being present for her son. She walked over, crouched beside him, and asked him to explain his project. Max beamed as he explained each planet in detail, his enthusiasm infectious. But even in this small victory, the weight of her strained relationship with Ryan lingered. She knew that attending a science fair wasn't enough to fix years of neglect. Ryan's absence hung over her like a dark cloud, and every moment of joy was tinged with the fear that it might be too late to repair the damage she had caused. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Emma sat alone in the living room, her thoughts consumed by Ryan's words. He had told her he needed time, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time wasn't the only thing he needed. She knew deep down that Ryan wanted something more. He wanted to feel valued, to feel like he mattered in a way that went beyond his role as a stay-at-home parent. Emma wasn't sure if she could give him that. Control had always been her armor, the thing that protected her from vulnerability. Letting go of that control, letting Ryan back into her life as an equal, meant confronting the fears she had buried for so long. It meant admitting that she wasn't perfect, that her success had come at a cost. In the quiet of the house, Emma finally allowed herself to cry. For years, she had believed that she could have it all, that she could be both a successful businesswoman and a loving wife and mother. But now, she wasn't sure if that was true. The life she had built was teetering on the edge, and for the first time, she didn't know how to fix it. As the tears dried on her face, Emma made a decision. She couldn't continue down the same path, hoping that things would magically get better. She needed to make real changes, starting with herself. And that meant reaching out to Ryan, not just to ask for forgiveness, but to genuinely listen to what he needed from her. Emma picked up her phone and stared at Ryan's contact for a long time before finally typing out a message. "I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you, and I want to fix this. I'm ready to talk whenever you are." She hit send and waited. Ryan's reply didn't come immediately, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Days passed after Emma sent the message to Ryan, but there was still no reply. Each time her phone buzzed with an email or a call, her heart would jump, only to sink when it wasn't from him. The silence between them stretched painfully, and Emma's mind began to wander into darker possibilities. Was he considering a divorce? Had she pushed him too far? The questions gnawed at her, making it difficult to concentrate on anything else. At work, she continued to excel, but the victories felt increasingly hollow. Her colleagues still admired her ability to close deals and command respect, but the emptiness of her personal life lingered, casting a shadow over everything she accomplished. Each time someone congratulated her on a new achievement, she felt a pang of guilt, knowing that her family was unraveling while she built her empire. It was in one of these moments, over coffee with a close friend, Sarah, that Emma finally opened up about what was going on. Sarah was one of the few people Emma could trust outside of work, someone who had seen the cracks in her life but had never judged her for them. As they sat at a small cafe downtown, Sarah listened quietly while Emma explained everything: the fight with Ryan, his leaving, the growing distance between her and the children. "I've tried everything, Sarah," Emma said, her voice thick with frustration. "I'm doing better at home. I went to Max's science fair, I'm cutting back on work hours, but nothing seems to change. I don't know if it's too late." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, her gaze thoughtful. "Have you thought about talking to someone? A therapist, maybe?" Emma blinked in surprise. Therapy had never crossed her mind. For so long, she had prided herself on being able to handle things on her own, on being in control. The idea of sharing her personal struggles with a stranger felt foreign, even uncomfortable. "I don't know if that's for me," Emma said, her tone hesitant. "Look, Em," Sarah said gently, leaning forward, "I know how much you value control, but you're not going to fix this by yourself. Therapy isn't about losing control, it's about gaining perspective. It might help you see things in a way you haven't before." Emma frowned, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. The thought of therapy stirred up old memories, of her father, Richard Hartley, and his constant lectures about control being power. He had drilled that lesson into her from a young age, always telling her that weakness was something to be avoided at all costs. Her success, her career, had been built on that philosophy. But now, it felt like the very thing that had made her strong was tearing her apart. After some more reflection and Sarah's encouragement, Emma agreed to give therapy a try. A week later, she found herself sitting in a therapist's office, nervously tapping her foot on the floor. The therapist, Dr. Martin, was a calm, patient woman with an air of quiet authority. She asked Emma questions about her childhood, her relationship with Ryan, and her role as a mother. At first, Emma found it difficult to open up. She was used to giving polished answers, the kind of responses that would get her through boardroom meetings. But as the sessions continued, Dr. Martin's probing questions began to chip away at the walls Emma had built around herself. They talked about her father, Richard, and how his lessons on control had shaped her. Richard Hartley had been a self-made man, the kind who believed that emotions were a liability. He had always expected Emma to be perfect, to never show weakness, and Emma had internalized that expectation. She had grown up believing that love and vulnerability were dangerous, things that could undermine her success. As Emma talked through these realizations, she began to understand how much of her need for control had been driven by fear of failure, fear of being vulnerable, fear of losing the image she had worked so hard to maintain. Dr. Martin helped her see that in trying to protect herself, she had shut out the people who mattered most to her. After weeks of therapy, Emma decided to take a bold step. She reached out to Ryan and asked if he would be willing to join her in therapy. To her surprise, he agreed, though his reply was cautious. He wasn't sure if therapy could fix their marriage, but he was willing to try. Their first session together was tense. Ryan was guarded, his body language closed off, as if he was still unsure whether Emma's efforts were genuine. They talked about the party, about Emma's humiliating comment, and about the years of neglect Ryan had endured. Emma listened, really listened, for the first time. She hadn't realized how deeply her behavior had hurt him, how invisible he had felt as her career took precedence over everything else. "I've spent so long putting you and the kids second," Emma admitted in a voice that trembled with emotion. "I thought I was doing it for us, for our future, but I see now that I was wrong. I wasn't there when you needed me, and I'm sorry." Ryan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if an apology is enough, Emma. I don't know if I can trust that you'll change." The words stung, but Emma understood. She had taken him for granted for so long, it was no surprise that Ryan was hesitant to believe in her newfound self-awareness. But she wasn't giving up. For the first time, she was willing to let go of control, to stop trying to manipulate the outcome and instead focus on rebuilding what she had broken. At home, her attempts to reconnect with Zoe and Max weren't going any smoother. Zoe was especially resistant to Emma's efforts. One evening, when Emma asked if they could spend some time together, Zoe had looked at her with bitter eyes and said, "Why now, Mom? After all this time, why do you care?" The question pierced Emma's heart. How could she explain to her daughter that it had taken losing everything for her to realize what truly mattered? She couldn't blame Zoe for her anger, but she also couldn't give up on trying to repair their relationship. Max, on the other hand, was more forgiving. He was still young enough to want his mother's attention, and Emma tried to be there for him in ways she hadn't been before, helping with homework, showing up at soccer games, and just being present. Slowly, she saw the walls between them start to lower, but it was clear that her absence had left scars on both her children. Work, for the first time in years, began to take a back seat. Emma started delegating responsibilities to her team and cutting back on the endless hours she once poured into her career. She knew she was still good at what she did, but it no longer defined her the way it once had. Her focus was on healing her family. Despite Emma's efforts, Ryan remained distant. He hadn't moved back home, and though they continued therapy, there was still a part of him that was hesitant to fully engage. He had spent years feeling invisible, and it wasn't something he could easily forgive or forget. Emma, however, was determined not to let her old habits of control and perfectionism sabotage the progress she had made. She had finally begun to understand that real success wasn't measured by professional accolades, but by the relationships that made life meaningful. Ryan had once been the center of her world, before her ambition had taken over. Now, as they worked through the painful truths of their marriage, Emma realized that she wanted that connection back. But she also understood that she couldn't demand it or force it to happen. It had to be rebuilt, step by step, with patience, understanding, and a willingness to truly change. As weeks turned into months, Emma began to feel a shift within herself. Therapy had opened her eyes to the things she had been avoiding for so long, and though the journey was far from over, she was starting to let go of the need for control that had once defined her. Her greatest challenge now was learning to trust herself to be vulnerable, and trust that her family might one day trust her again. It was a cold, drizzly evening when Emma finally confronted Ryan face to face. After months of separation, tension, and unresolved emotions, she found herself standing in front of his brother's house, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't planned to come here tonight, but after another fruitless therapy session and a particularly cold encounter with Zoe, Emma knew she couldn't wait any longer. The time for reflection was over. She needed answers, needed to know where they stood. The door opened, and there he was, Ryan, looking older, wearier than when he'd left. His face was unreadable as he stood in the doorway, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, shielding himself from her, emotionally and physically. Emma's throat tightened at the sight of him. She had memorized every detail of his face over the years, but this man before her felt like a stranger. Emma, Ryan greeted her with a tone so neutral it cut through her like a knife. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk," she said, her voice more urgent than she intended. "We need to talk." Ryan sighed, hesitating before stepping aside to let her in. The air inside the house was heavy with tension as Emma took a seat on the worn couch. Ryan remained standing, watching her from across the room, arms still crossed, his stance defensive. It felt like a battle was about to begin, and Emma wasn't sure she had the strength to fight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with all the unspoken words and unresolved conflicts that had built up over the years. Finally, Emma couldn't take it anymore. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything, for making you feel like you didn't matter. For putting my career first. For making you feel invisible." Ryan's expression softened, but only slightly. He took a deep breath before responding. "You said you're sorry before, Emma. And I know you mean it, but I don't know if that's enough anymore." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She had prepared for this, but hearing it out loud, hearing Ryan say he wasn't sure if he could forgive her, was far more painful than she'd imagined. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to break down. "Not yet. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," Emma said, her voice shaking. "But I'm trying. I've been in therapy, I've cut back on work, I'm doing everything I can to fix this." Ryan's face hardened again. "But it's always on your terms, isn't it? Everything is about your control. Even now, you think you can just manage this, like it's another business deal you can negotiate." Emma flinched at the accusation, her breath catching in her throat. "That's not fair." "No, Emma," Ryan interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "What's not fair is how you've treated me for the last decade. I gave up everything, my career, my dreams, because I believed in us, in you. I thought we were building a life together. But you left me behind. You left all of us behind." His words tore through her, the raw emotion behind them shaking her to her core. Emma had always known Ryan resented the sacrifices he had made, but she had never truly understood the depth of his pain until now. "I thought I was doing what was best for our family," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought if I worked hard enough, succeeded enough, I could give us everything we needed." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Everything you needed, Emma. You weren't doing it for us. You were doing it for you." The truth of his words hung in the air between them, undeniable. Emma had spent so many years convincing herself that her success was for her family, that every late night and missed event was for their future. But deep down, she had always known it was about more than that. It was about her need for control, her fear of failure, her desperate desire to prove herself to the world, and to her father. "I don't know if I can come back from this," Ryan continued, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "I love you, Emma. I always have. But I don't know if I can live with someone who can't see beyond herself." Emma's heart raced, her chest tightening with panic. This was it. The moment she had feared, the moment she could lose him for good. And for the first time, she realized that no amount of control could change that. She had pushed him too far, taken too much, and now she was on the verge of losing everything that mattered. "I don't want to lose you," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't lose you." Ryan's gaze softened for a moment, and Emma saw a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But the distance between them was still there, a chasm that felt too wide to cross. I don't want to lose you either, Ryan said quietly, his voice filled with sadness. But I don't know if I can live like this anymore. I need to know that things will change, not just for a few weeks, but for good. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face now. She was losing her grip, losing the very thing that had driven her for so long, control. But this time, she wasn't going to fight it. She couldn't. She had to let go. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared of losing you, of losing the kids, of failing as a wife and a mother. I've spent my whole life trying to be perfect, trying to prove that I'm strong and capable, but all I've done is hurt the people I love the most. Ryan didn't say anything, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. He had been hurt, deeply, but there was still love there, buried beneath the layers of resentment and pain. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, Emma continued, her voice raw with emotion. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I can change. I don't know how, but I want to try. I want to make things right. Ryan stood in silence for a long time, his eyes searching hers. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both, the air thick with tension and uncertainty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ryan spoke. I'll come back, he said softly, his voice hesitant. But this can't just be words, Emma. It has to be real. If we're going to make this work, you need to show me, show all of us, that we matter to you more than your career, more than your need for control. Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. This was her chance, her last chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. I promise, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. I'll do whatever it takes. Ryan gave a small nod, but the look in his eyes told her that this was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, and Emma knew it would take more than promises to heal the wounds she had caused. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. As she left Ryan's brother's house and stepped into the cold night air, Emma realized that the hardest part was yet to come. But she was ready to face it, ready to fight for her family, even if it meant letting go of the one thing she had always clung to, control. Emma returned home that night with a mixture of exhaustion and a fragile sense of hope. The confrontation with Ryan had drained her emotionally, but it also left her feeling lighter, as if some of the weight she had carried for years was finally lifting. Still, she knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Ryan had agreed to come back, but it wasn't a guarantee of reconciliation. He had made it clear, he needed more than words, and she had a long way to go to prove that she could change. The following days were a test of Emma's resolve. She threw herself into making amends, but not in the rushed, control-driven way she used to. This time, she slowed down. She listened. She spent more time at home, showing up for Zoe and Max in ways she hadn't before. She put work on the back burner, delegating responsibilities and trusting her team to handle things without her constant oversight. One evening, she surprised Max by showing up at his soccer game. It was a small gesture, but when he saw her in the stands, his face lit up in a way she hadn't seen in months. After the game, he ran to her, excitement bubbling in his voice as he recounted every play. Emma listened, genuinely present for the first time in a long while. Zoe, however, was still distant. The teenage years were already difficult, but Emma's years of emotional absence had built a wall between them that wasn't easy to tear down. Zoe had been hurt the most by Emma's neglect, and even though Emma was trying, Zoe wasn't ready to forgive so easily. One night, Emma knocked on Zoe's door, asking if she could come in. Zoe, sitting on her bed with her headphones on, looked at her mother with a mixture of frustration and resignation. Reluctantly, she pulled the headphones off and nodded. I know I've hurt you, Emma began, her voice soft, unsure of how to reach her daughter. And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want to try to make things better between us. I miss you, Zoe. I want to be part of your life. Zoe looked down, avoiding eye contact, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. You always say you're going to try, but then you just go back to work, and nothing ever changes. The words cut Emma deeply, but she knew Zoe had every right to feel that way. You're right, Emma admitted. I haven't been there for you, and I've broken a lot of promises. But I'm doing things differently now. I'm cutting back at work. I'm going to therapy. I'm trying, Zoe. I just need you to give me a chance. For a moment, Zoe didn't say anything. The silence between them was heavy, and Emma feared that her daughter might shut her out for good. But then, Zoe finally looked up, her eyes filled with uncertainty and pain. I don't know if I can trust you, Zoe said quietly. You've let me down so many times. Emma's heart broke at the sight of her daughter's vulnerability. She had been so consumed by her own ambitions that she hadn't realized how much damage she had done to the people she loved the most. I know, Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And I'm so sorry. But I'm not giving up on us, Zoe. I'm going to keep trying, even if it takes time. Zoe didn't respond right away, but the fact that she hadn't dismissed Emma outright was a small victory. Emma stood, her heart heavy but determined. As she left the room, she glanced back at Zoe, who had put her headphones on again, her expression distant but no longer hostile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Ryan's return to the house was tentative. He moved back in, but the emotional distance between them remained. They shared the same space, but the warmth that had once defined their relationship was absent. At night, they slept in the same bed, but miles apart, figuratively. Conversations were polite but guarded, and there were moments when Emma feared that despite all her efforts, she had already lost him. Ryan still attended therapy with Emma, but his hesitancy was clear. While Emma had opened up more about her fears and her need for control, Ryan was slower to trust her newfound resolve. He had spent too many years being overlooked, and he wasn't willing to rush into forgiveness. Emma, however, was patient. She understood now that this was a marathon, not a sprint. Weeks passed, and slowly, cracks began to appear in Ryan's walls. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, watching a movie with Max, Ryan casually reached over and took her hand. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, but for Emma, it felt monumental. She didn't comment, didn't make a big deal out of it. Instead, she simply squeezed his hand gently in return, a silent acknowledgement of the small step they had taken toward healing. The moments of connection grew more frequent. Ryan started joining Emma in conversations about the kids, and they began sharing small details of their day, something they hadn't done in years. It wasn't much, but it was progress. One night, as they lay in bed, Emma took a deep breath and spoke into the darkness. Do you think we can ever get back to where we were? Ryan was silent for a long time, and Emma wondered if he was going to answer at all. But then, he sighed. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were, he said honestly. Too much has happened. But maybe we can build something new. The words sent a surge of hope through Emma. Maybe they couldn't go back to the way things used to be, but that didn't mean they couldn't find a new way forward, something stronger, something built on honesty and understanding. In the weeks that followed, Emma continued to prioritize her family over work. She was present at Zoe's school events, even though Zoe still kept her distance. She made time for Max, engaging with him in ways that she hadn't before. And she made a conscious effort to show Ryan that she was committed to making their marriage work, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, everyday actions. But there were still challenges. Emma struggled to fully relinquish control at work, and there were days when the pull of her old habits was strong. There were moments when she wanted to dive back into her career and let it consume her like it used to, but each time, she reminded herself of what was at stake. Her family was worth more than any deal, any client, any success. One evening, as Emma was preparing dinner, a simple meal, far from the extravagant dinners she used to host for clients, Zoe entered the kitchen. There was a moment of hesitation before Zoe spoke. "Mom," she said quietly, "can we talk?" Emma turned, her heart racing. Zoe hadn't initiated a conversation with her in weeks. "Of course," Emma replied, her voice steady but filled with hope. Zoe took a deep breath. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet," she began, her tone uncertain. "But I can see that you're trying." Anne. I want to give you a chance. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had been waiting for this, for any sign that Zoe might be willing to let her back in. Thank you, Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I promise, I won't let you down this time. Zoe gave a small nod, her expression still guarded but softer than before. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Emma knew she still had a long way to go, but this moment, this small step, meant everything. As the evening went on, the Hartleys gathered around the dinner table. There was still tension, still unresolved feelings, but for the first time in a long while, there was also laughter. Small, tentative, but real. Emma looked around at her family, at Ryan, Zoe, and Max, and for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. Maybe things would never be perfect. Maybe they couldn't go back to the way things were. But they could move forward, together. And for Emma, that was enough. Months passed, and life in the Hartley household slowly began to stabilize. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was real, a new beginning shaped by effort, patience, and small victories. Emma had come a long way from the woman who once prioritized control and success above all else, but the journey wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt and setbacks, but the changes she had worked so hard to implement were taking root. Ryan was back in the house, and while things were still fragile between them, there was a sense of hope that had been missing for years. Their therapy sessions continued, and they were slowly learning to communicate in ways that hadn't been possible before. The resentment and pain that had built up over the years hadn't vanished, but they were beginning to heal. One Saturday morning, Emma and Ryan sat together at the kitchen table, drinking coffee in a comfortable silence. It was a rare, peaceful moment, and Emma cherished it. She no longer felt the need to fill the silence with reassurances or promises. For once, she was content just being present. Do you think we're really doing this? Ryan asked, breaking the silence. Emma looked at him, his expression soft, but still filled with the caution that had defined their relationship since his return. I think we are, Emma said honestly. It's not perfect, but we're trying. And that's more than we've done in a long time. Ryan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Yeah. We are. They shared a look that spoke of all the unspoken fears and hopes they were still grappling with. Emma knew it would take more than just trying, it would take real, continuous work. But for the first time, she believed they had a chance. Later that day, Emma attended one of Zoe's school events, a dance recital she had promised to come to. Emma sat in the audience, her eyes glued to the stage, as Zoe performed with a grace and confidence that made her heart swell with pride. When the recital ended, Emma waited outside the auditorium, her heart racing as she hoped Zoe would acknowledge her presence. When Zoe finally came out, their eyes met, and for the first time in months, Zoe smiled, an honest, unguarded smile. Emma felt a lump in her throat as her daughter walked up to her. You came, Zoe said, her voice soft but filled with something new, hope. I wouldn't have missed it, Emma replied, her voice thick with emotion. Zoe hesitated for a moment before hugging her mother, a small, tentative embrace, but it was enough. Emma held her daughter tightly, feeling the weight of all the time they had lost, but also the promise of what lay ahead. That night, back at home, the family gathered for dinner. There was still an undercurrent of tension between them at times, but it was overshadowed by a new sense of togetherness. They talked, they laughed, and for the first time in what felt like years, they felt like a family again. After dinner, Emma and Ryan sat on the back porch, watching the sunset in silence. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the warm glow casting a serene light over their home. Emma rested her head on Ryan's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. I didn't think we'd make it here, Ryan admitted quietly. Neither did I, Emma replied, her voice soft. But I'm glad we did. Ryan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was filled with the quiet intimacy they had lost over the years. Emma closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the moment wash over her. As the months continued, Emma made a conscious effort to maintain the balance she had finally found. She had reduced her hours at work significantly, learning to trust her team and delegate responsibilities. It was a difficult adjustment at first, letting go of control, but she had come to realize that her success didn't have to come at the expense of her family. Work would always be important to her, but it no longer defined her. Her identity was no longer tied to the next big deal or the admiration of her colleagues. For the first time, she found fulfillment in the small, everyday moments, watching Max play soccer, attending Zoe's school events, and sharing quiet evenings with Ryan. There were still challenges, of course. There were days when Emma felt the pull of her old habits, the desire to throw herself back into work and reclaim the control she had once prized. But each time that urge surfaced, she reminded herself of what she stood to lose. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Emma sat down with Ryan in the living room. They hadn't talked about the future much, both of them still cautious about making promises they weren't sure they could keep. But tonight, Emma felt ready. "I've been thinking," Emma began, her voice steady but nervous. "About us. About the future." Ryan looked at her, his expression curious but cautious. "What about it?" "I don't want to go back to the way things were," Emma said, her heart racing. "I know I've hurt you, and I know we're not there yet. But I want us to keep building something new. I want us to be a family again, not just going through the motions, but really being there for each other." Ryan's gaze softened, and for the first time, Emma saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with years ago, the man who had stood by her side through everything, even when she hadn't deserved it. "I want that too," Ryan said quietly. "But it's going to take time. We're still figuring things out." "I know," Emma replied. "And I'm okay with that. I'm not expecting everything to be perfect. I just want us to keep trying." Ryan reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We will." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. Emma smiled, feeling the weight of their shared history and the hope of their future. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time, Emma believed they could get there, together. As they sat there, hand in hand, the silence between them was no longer filled with tension or unspoken fears. Instead, it was a quiet, comfortable peace, the kind that only comes when you've faced the worst and survived. Emma had finally let go of the need for control, and in doing so, she had found something far more valuable, a family, a life, and a future she could believe in. The journey had been long, and the scars were still there. But for Emma Hartley, the path forward was clear. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be present. And for her, that was enough.